Hello there, thank you for joining me again. My name is Anne Orbin and I'm recording from my kitchen in Ashburton in Devon. And today I want to just share a few thoughts and ideas with you about the possible inadvertent negative consequences of the rigid travel ban under which we find ourselves now. So, just to be clear, I'm an ex-doctor and therefore I was well aware of the risks of the coronavirus being transmitted, and I therefore chose to self-isolate very early. I also persuaded many of my friends who, like me, live alone, that preparing for self-isolation and then carrying it out was a very good idea. Now, understandably, many people were anxious about this. Many of us are simply not used to being on our own, and that raises fears. And also, quite honestly, this is not really the time to be alone. We need comfort and support. But nonetheless, I initially reassured my friends by saying, this is the logic behind it. If we go into self-isolation for 7 to 10 days and develop no symptoms, we know we're virus-free. So that makes us a safe person. And initially I thought it would be possible for one safe person to travel in the sealed bubble of their car to visit another safe person who had also self-isolated, so that there could be opportunities to meet, for comfort, for laughter, and, as one of my friends said, most importantly, so that we can have a hug. And I agreed with her at that time. But then the next step was the imposition of the rigid travel ban. And I find it somewhat ironic that I could travel out for essential booze and fags, but I couldn't go to comfort a friend in need. But that's another issue. So, we've now been informed just today that the ban on travel is likely to carry on for longer than we thought. So initially we expected it to be the middle of April. And most people can be quite resilient for a fixed period of time. They've got the end date in mind, and it's a bit like crossing off the days on your calendar until you can finish work and have your holiday or whatever's happening next. But that's now unlikely to happen. It's likely, I understand today, that travel bans might be imposed until June, and even that could be extended. So I've been thinking today about a possible plan that we should really be thinking about now, to have some flexibility in the travel ban and the benefits of that. So not only am I an ex-doctor, but the work that I did as a doctor was as a psychiatrist. And I'm very concerned that we may end up with a secondary epidemic, and that epidemic could be mental health problems. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So, being with other people is a human need, and also physical touch is a human need, whether that be the hug that my friend is desperate for, or being stroked, or indeed having wonderful sex. All of those things make us feel connected, make us feel more alive, make us feel more human, and indeed we know that physical contact is very good for our physical well-being, our emotional health, and indeed it boosts our immune systems. So is there a way that we, people who live alone and have self-isolated for a period, might be able to get together with other people who've self-isolated? And what I'm asking you to think about is the possibility of permits, so discretionary travel permits. Now, I don't know anybody personally with a great deal of influence, but I'm hoping that somebody who ends up watching this little video may have some influence in this regard. So these are the kind of things that I've been thinking about. There could be safeguards around who could apply for a discretionary travel permit. So, people who have self-isolated and have been symptom-free for 10 days or whatever period of time is designated will know that they're not carrying the coronavirus. And there's another group of people who would also be safe. That's people who have had symptoms and fully recovered, meaning that they're now immune. We could prove, if that's the right word, that we have been self-isolating, because the councils all have registers of people who qualify for the single occupancy council tax discount. And there would be other ways too of proving that we've been alone and self-isolated, such as the location markers on smartphones, or having been on a register for volunteers to drop off our shopping, or it could even be more flexible and it could be the report of a neighbour confirming that we've definitely stayed in. We could also apply for highly specific contact. So we could name the person that we want to visit and where they live, and we could state why we want to visit that person. And if it was possible for these discretionary travel permits that I'm advocating to be given out, the police and park rangers, who are currently entirely appropriately stopping people from having travel at the moment, would just look at our registration number and know where we're going, why we're going there, and that it's okay, and they could wave us on or give us a thumbs up. So, what we could be doing is going to visit somebody else who we know is struggling on their own. They might be at risk of falling into despair, anxiety, even terror. They may be looking at this awful, uncertain future with horror, and just the physical presence of someone else could be enough to stop them developing mental health problems. I mean, there's not going to be services available for mental health problems. Already, people that work in psychiatric services are being asked to upskill so that they can offer physical care in emergency hospitals. So we need to be supporting our own. And yes, I know we can all increase our contact with telephone calls and all the wonderful ways of video messaging, but it's not the same as having physical contact. So we might want to go and visit someone, just be with them for a few hours. We might actually want to go and pick that person up to come and stay with us for a while. And I think we're going to see, if it's possible to do it, a lot of single households combining, at least temporarily, which will be fantastic because it will reduce the number of essential trips out that need to be made, the number of volunteers that are required to service people on their own. And I can see friends coming together in this way, but let's face it, there's also an awful lot of partners, even spouses, who live in separate houses for reasons of work or choice or whatever. And people combining together like that would be a very healthy thing to do, in my opinion. So, let's have a think as well about some of the other reasons we might want to, if we're lucky enough, have somebody come to live with us in a spare room. So, somebody could be discharged very rapidly from hospital after an operation, or they might have needed treatment for severe symptoms of coronavirus and be left physically depleted and actually traumatised as a result of that. And of course, We always had the tradition of convalescence homes. They've all closed down now, but convalescence means coming together with others or another person so that healing and recovery can take place. And our own homes, if we're lucky enough to have one or more spare rooms, could become those convalescence homes, or even community hubs for the same, if we feel we'd be able to share our homes with somebody that we don't actually know or didn't know previously. So, the other benefits would be that if we were allowed to use a discretionary travel permit, local services would know where we're going, and they might know whether there are people on our way there or back who need supplies dropping off, and this would release the pressure on volunteers or other service providers that are currently providing those services. Because let's face it, our keen and willing volunteers at the moment, if this goes on and on and on, may develop compassion fatigue and really feel that they just need to look after themselves for a while. So that non-virus carrying people who've self-isolated could become the second wave of volunteers, or even might think of themselves as the compassion army, going out with compassion to support people who are on their own. So just to bring this a bit more alive, a bit more personal, if today I could apply for a discretionary travel permit, I would ask if I could have one to go and visit a friend of mine who's very sadly in the terminal stages of ovarian cancer in a hospice. And the staff this week reluctantly had to make the decision that they could no longer allow visitors, because they were worried about the virus being brought into the hospice, which could decimate the staff, mean that the hospice had to be closed. But can you imagine the agony of knowing that you're dying and you can't even have a visitor? But somebody who's been designated as a safe visitor might be allowed to visit. And if I could, I would try to facilitate my friend's one last wish. The one thing that she wants to do before she dies is to just be taken in a car to sit somewhere where she can look at the sea. And what a lovely thing it would be to be able to offer that. On a simpler level, another friend of mine lives on her own in a remote village on the moor, and she lives very simply, normally. She occupies herself in her own home and has a lovely garden, but she, unlike many people, doesn't have a television, doesn't have a smartphone, doesn't have access to the internet, and doesn't have a washing machine. And that's exactly the sort of friend I would love to be able to bring legally back to my house for a few days, so that she could make use of my facilities and build up her resilience to go back for her next period of self-isolation. I also know people who didn't self-isolate when we were first encouraged to do so, and delayed a week, you know. So while they're sitting out their self-isolation and waiting to make sure they're either virus-free because they have no symptoms, or they get symptoms and hopefully recover from them, it would be lovely to think that they could look forward at the end of that 7 to 10 day period to being able to visit someone or go somewhere to someone's home to be looked after. And I'm thinking in particular of a friend of mine's father, who's in his 90s, whose only social contact has been going out shopping over the last few days, because his own son can't visit him, as his son is very high risk and is having to self-isolate himself. And I'd absolutely love it if I could invite him to my house for a little holiday, cook his favourite meals and treat him like a king for a bit. So those are some of the very practical reasons why we might want to apply for one of these permits, which don't actually yet exist. As I mentioned earlier, I think that there's going to be an increase in single households combining to be joint households while we all sit this one out. And I can even be optimistic that this might lead to a sustainable model of co-housing in the future, where people come together using less resources, needing less computers, less washing machines, less freezers, because let's face it, we're all going to be short of things in the future if we're all lucky enough to survive. So a new way of living could come from this compassion model if we're lucky. Now, in a future video, I'm planning to use my experience as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist to talk about the sort of fears that can rise about being on our own if we're not used to it, and managing the extremely difficult emotions that could be coming up. And if you want to tune into that next video, I do now have a YouTube channel, which is Anne Aubin, ANNEAUBIN, and if you go onto YouTube and search Anne Aubin UK, you'll go onto my channel rather than somebody else's in another country. And if you subscribe, which of course is totally free, you'll just get a notification when the next video goes up. But I'm going to keep this one short, keep it punchy. What I'm asking is, if there's anybody watching this who has any influence over anybody in mental health services, the town council, the district council, in government, why don't we start up a movement to try and get safe discretionary travel permits as a system, so that we can all support one another, show compassion to our fellow human beings, and reduce the risk of mental health problems as a nation. So thank you very much indeed for watching, and I hopefully will see you again. Bye for now.